The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Vesey, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the subject of the special order.
Without objection.
It is with great honor that I rise today to co-anchor this CBC Special Order Hour, and also want to acknowledge the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, Mr. Cedric Richmond from the state of Louisiana, and other members that are here to participate. And for the next 60 minutes, we have a chance to speak directly to the American people on issues of great importance to the Congressional Black Caucus, the constituents that we all represent in our various districts. And for this particular special order hour, I am going to open it up and begin to talk about something that is very important and has been widely discussed within the Congressional Black Caucus, and that is civil rights and the and some of the things that we're worried about that are going on within the Justice Department. And we have several important, again, members here to speak on these. And before I go any further, I want to go ahead and recognize them. The first speaker that we have is from the state of South Carolina, representing the state's 6th Congressional District, and also our caucus's assistant leader, that is Mr. Jim Clyburn. And Representative Clyburn, thank you for joining and being a part of this special order hour to talk about this subject that is very, very important to so many members of the Black Caucus.
Mr. Speaker, request permission to address the House and provide an extent.
Gentlemen may proceed.
I thank my friend for yielding me this time, and I thank him and our colleague Eddie Bernice Johnson for joining me at the Center for African American Studies at the University of Texas at Arlington last Thursday evening. It was a wonderful experience for me and President Visca Kabari, Dr. Jason Skelton, and my longtime friend, Dr. Marvin Delaney, were perfect hosts. Mr. Speaker, earlier this month, Sergeant LaDavid T. Johnson died a hero's death in a distant land on a mission few Americans know about or understand. This weekend, his grieving family, including his pregnant wife, took him to his final resting place in Florida. Sergeant Johnson's tragic death leaves this young family fatherless. Mr. Speaker, in his second inaugural address, President Abraham Lincoln called on our nation to endeavor to care for him who shall have borne the battle and for his widow and his orphan. Unfortunately, rather than comfort Sergeant Johnson's grieving family, the current occupant of the White House has chosen to use them as his latest prop in the constant effort to sow discord and division in this country. The President and White House Chief of Staff John Kelly, who happens to be a 4-star general, have insulted and smeared an honorable public servant who happens to be a 5-star congresswoman, and in effect called her and the grieving widow her constituent liars. Congresswoman Frederica S. Wilson has been a champion for the people of South Florida for decades. It is no mystery, and it's not political, that she was accompanying Mrs. Johnson and her family to receive her husband's remains. She had mentored Sergeant Johnson throughout his childhood. I have participated in several of Congresswoman Wilson's 500 Role Models events and have spoken for one of their graduations. I often wear this red tie to this floor, helping her highlight their efforts, and her passionate work on behalf of those kidnapped girls of Boko Haram is unmatched. As a husband of a 5-star African-American woman for more than 56 years, and the father of 3 African-American daughters who are working hard to earn their stars every day, I feel compelled to respond to General Kelly and completely disregard his concocted misrepresentations. Mr. Speaker, we can have political differences here in Washington. That comes with the territory. But people need to have the common decency and basic humanity to refrain from exacerbating the pain of those already suffering so much. I was taught from childhood that silence gives consent. I want the White House to know this. I and the members of the Congressional Black Caucus will not be silent, and we will not be silenced. I'll yield back.
Mr. Clyburn, thank you very much for your comments, very timely comments, very serious comments, and I hope that all of the members that are here on both sides of the aisle realize the seriousness of the comments. There's nothing humorous about them at all, nothing to be smiling or laughing about. This very timely in light of the unfortunate incident that happened with our colleague, and thank you very much for bringing that to light. And now I'd like to recognize my colleague, my fellow Texan from the 18th Congressional District in Houston. Thank you very much, Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, for joining us this evening. We look forward to your words.
I thank the manager, Mr. Veazey, for his leadership, but his sensitivities and sensibilities and empathy, knowing his distinguished wife and the leadership she gives to the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. I'm sure that there are many women in your family, and I know that you have a great honor and respect for them. It is appropriate to follow the leader, Mr. Clyburn, who is vested in the storied history of African Americans from the east to the west and north to the south. He often diminishes his status by saying that he was raised in a parish house. But when he eloquently rises to the floor to defend, all eyes and all ears are tuned to him. Now, I want to adhere to our discussion today because it is extremely important, and to also acknowledge my colleagues, and so let me hurry through my comments. I do want to acknowledge the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, and that is Cedric Richmond, and thank the caucus for the eloquent, the women of the caucus for their eloquent statement, pointed statement regarding the series of events that have occurred. Let me first of all say that our topic today deals with a retracing of the horrible history that was perpetrated under FBI Director Hoover for the decades that he served in that capacity. So as I label what it is, let me just for a moment deviate for what happened this weekend. I believe that the FBI personnel through much of its history were mostly men, fine men who wanted to protect this nation. But you see, Mr. Speaker, I have firsthand knowledge of the devastation of FBI surveillance way before the word terrorism became part of our normal discussion or language. So I want to put a pause there and say that in the history of African Americans, we have been subjected to name calling. That's what happens to you when, in the Constitution, you're not a complete human being. That's what happens to you, that even after the Emancipation Proclamation and the short-lived Reconstruction, the nation rushed toward the hanging fruit, Jim Crowism, and the rampant murder of African Americans in the Deep South. Some of the very states of which the president stood and called young African American men son of a bees. There's another name calling. And so it seems that even as we have gone through the transition of freedom, and we came through the 20th century with civil rights, then affirmative action, that name calling seems to be the welcomed and accepted tactic to use with people of color, and in this instance, African Americans. What would be the explanation for the unseemly events that occurred around a grieving mother, aunts and uncles, and a grieving widow with beautiful children who will no longer have their dad? I offer my sympathy to Sergeants Wright and Black and Johnson, as well as Sergeant LaDavia Johnson. And so how their loss, to no fault of their own, in the battle for this nation, turned into an ugly name-calling, I am baffled, except for the fact that it is easy to call African Americans names. It is easy for some white Americans to call African Americans names. When we're on the floor of the House and we say things that are untoward in some segments of the population, our phones ring off the hook with the word NNN. I don't know how many of my friends who are not people of color, I'm sure we all say things that people disagree with, and I don't know whether they call up and call them white, white, white. You see, race is something that we're fearful of discussing. And that is because the thought would be, here she goes again. But there is a great love. My interaction, my life's history is with the diversity of this world. From white, Caucasians, Anglo in Texas, to Hispanics, African Americans, Asians, and beyond, and various religions. I feel comfortable in my soul. But this weekend was the most difficult time. And for African American women who, in the category of casting the caste system at the bottom of the totem pole, even today, the likes of Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Mae Jemison, Shirley Chisholm, Barbara Jordan, doctors, lawyers, and others, we are at the bottom. So there was much latitude, uncontrolled latitude, in name calling. 45 mentioning untoward words about our colleague, Congresswoman Wilson. Name calling. Nobody, there's no retribution or reprimand. None of his constituents would give a hoot. But it was name calling. Mr. Speaker, you don't know how many people stop me in airports and along the road, hurt and appalled. Now let me just come to a close on that. First of all, Congressman Clyburn has already given the attributes of Congresswoman Wilson. I do want to add that she's a principal. And she's an old-fashioned principal, though she's a young woman. And she loved her students, and she implemented this 5,000 role models. But she took the children as family. And this Sergeant LaDavia Johnson was one of those. And so if people don't understand the cultural distinctions in the African American community, we are aunts and uncles without bloodline. We're godparents. We're family. Her presence in that car was not an interloper. She didn't break the door down. She was in there as family. She was not eavesdropping. The phone was on, as indicated by Mrs. Johnson's interview. She asked the phone to be put on speaker. And it seems that her offense and breaking down moved the representative to articulate, probably seeking some humanity, to say, can you just, if you hear my words, apologize? That never happened. The untruth spread all over, because you see, as an African-American woman, you don't have to worry about saying the truth about us. We are various names, son of a bees. We've got all kinds of disturbing situations going on that we can be called. And that's what this White House did. And my dear friend, who I knew in the Southern Command, that's what happens when you're here for just a few years, his great leadership and the loss, I was here when that happened. And I don't want to spend a moment to diminish his status as a Gold Star parent. He has a right to mourn and to speak of his loss. But then when you are forced to step from that humble position over to the untruth, you can do it to a black woman. They have no power. I can talk something that doesn't have any truth because I have to defend, and this is said lovingly, a white man who happens to be in the Oval Office. We don't count. Largest group of active civic women in all kinds of organizations. If there's something being done, first of all, it's women overall. I love them all, but you'll see the African-American woman. She's in there scrubbing, she's in there teaching, she's in there handling the religious institutions, she's standing by babies, and she's standing by young people. She's in there civil rights activist, she's in there being a scientist, as I said, a doctor. She's in there being a president of various organizations. She's just in there. And that's what happened that has brought me to this point, that what we have now is so dangerous. I hope before the end of the week, maybe before the end of tomorrow, my good friend General Kelly seeks to apologize for the distortion. He didn't have to defend a person who does it in his own way and besmirch all of the Gold Star families and this young mother who has not been able to see. And Mr. Speaker, I know there are many of those who've served in this nation and served in this Congress. They've seen their brethren fall. They have been injured. What is it like for the family not to be able to see the body? What is it like to know that the body was not found, or the person, for 48 hours? I'm going to get to an end, my colleagues. I just want to say this. There are those of us who know about the African Command. There are those of us who knew there were soldiers there, because the Congressional Black Caucus was instrumental with George Bush to say that an African command needs to stand up when Charles Taylor was killing his citizens in Liberia. I know it firsthand, all those countries I've been to. I know ISIL is connecting with Boko Haram. We've been trying to say it, but people have had deaf ears, maybe because it's Africa. Now, all of a sudden, we're awake. Congresswoman Wilson knew that. She has been there. We have been there. Why don't people listen to black women, that they know what they're talking about, along with our distinguished colleagues? So this document that I hold in my hand, the Black Identity, Extremists Likely Motivated to Target Law Enforcement Officers, I have a lot to say on this, but I'm just going to summarize. As a member of the Judiciary Committee, this is name-calling. We've just got through a reckless weekend of name-calling of a distinguished member of Congress. That this is name-calling. This is the FBI defining BIE as individuals who seek through unlawful acts of force or violence a response to perceived racism and injustice. But you know what will happen, Mr. Speaker? This will be a big fishnet. The high school student who's getting his fists up, the college student who's rallying around in opposition to racism, The students down in Charlottesville who may believe they should stand up and be counted. I know this, Mr. Speaker, because with a little bit of humor, I'm young going backwards, but I served on the Select Committee on Assassinations that investigated the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, the reopening of the investigation, along with John F. Kennedy. I was immersed in the files of COINTELPRO. I saw how the FBI dogged a prophet, a modern-day prophet, a man that only wanted peace and believed in the beloved community. Yes, he was human. And you can find someone, when you dog them, throwing gum on a sidewalk. Dr. Martin Luther King was subjected to the COINTEL program. It was dastardly and devastating, and may have been the basis of the loss of his life. If he was subjected to the COINTELPRO, we always wondered, why couldn't he have been in another hotel? And so the danger of this document that has come under Donald Trump, not under any other president, not Bill Clinton, not George Bush, not Obama, President Obama, as I understand it. It came in August of this year under President Trump, the same president that could find nothing distinctive between the alt-right and racist vileness, talking about Jews and blacks and everybody else in Charlottesville. There was good people on both sides. Now this document, lo and behold, what other names are black activists, African Americans, still fighting the war of civil rights peacefully, that may be caught up in this large net? Again, I want to be able to say my respect for the service of FBI agents. They are friends of mine. I'm on the Judiciary Committee. They're friends of all of us. We continue to salute their service. But this document is a riotous document. So I close with this, and I ask unanimous consent to place this in the record. The history of surveillance and the black community. It goes into the discussion. It says, we mentioned that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the targets of the very surveillance that eventually led to the formation of the First Church Committee. This Black History Month, we should remember that many African American activists who were targeted by intelligence agencies, their stories serve as cautionary terms for expanding the surveillance of the state. Where are the conservatives to stand up against this document? We can be safe and we can have the First Amendment, and we can speak our different issues. But now we're going to entrap African Americans, young men who are kneeling because of their concern for police reform and violence that has taken the lives of African American young men. There are so many law enforcement officers that agree with me on the idea of police reform to help all of us work together. We're not divided, but we will stay divided with a document that is going to label us. Where's a document for the alt-right, the religious right, the white nationalists, the white supremacists? Where is that? And when are we going to understand that the calling of names, in our community we say, calling me out of my name, by the majority community, is a carryover from slavery and Jim Crowism. And I am saddened by the last couple of days of steering away from the mourning of those wonderful heroes who reflected the greatness of America. They reflected what young men do and young women willing to sacrifice their lives, and they go without a recognition of what color their fellow soldier is. And we honor them with no distinction. And that's what the last couple of days should have been, and the loving care of that widow and the families of the other young men. But yet, in the spirit of the FBI COINTELPRO, that may be the downfall, again, of those of us trying to heal and not reflecting on how the best way to deal with those who would do us harm violently, of which I stand against. We're now in the midst of name calling, and I go to my seat mourning, mourning, mourning. When is America going to change?
Thank my colleague from Texas, from the 18th Congressional District, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. Thank you for your comments. And now I would like to bring my friend and classmate from New Jersey, Donald Payne Jr., who is representing New Jersey's 10th Congressional District. And thank you again for your participation this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to want to thank the gentleman from the Lone Star State, my classmate, Congressman Vesey, for hosting tonight's special order hour. And Mr. Speaker, it is unfortunate that we find ourselves in this position where the lines are being so blurred that Gold Star families have come into this political discussion and dragged into this unwillingly over the past several days. I have a great respect for General Kelly, and was very delighted to see him get the job as Chief of Staff to maybe bring some semblance of calm and normalcy to the White House. But it seems like he's been infected by the disease, and that is a scourge in the White House. There is no reason for him to fabricate what one of our colleagues said. The videotape is there. Never did she do one thing that General Kelly said she did on that fateful day in the dedication to that FBI building. I don't understand what's going on with people these days, but these are the times we find ourselves in. Mr. Speaker, as much as we'd like to live in a colorblind society, in America, where people should be judged by the content of the character and not the color of their skin, we aren't there yet. Race, unfortunately, still matters. Juries devalue black lives by punishing offenders more harshly when their victims are white than when their victims are black. Police are more likely to use force when interacting with black people than when interacting with white people. Emergency room doctors are less likely to prescribe pain medication to black patients than to whites. And results from psychological studies of racial bias have shown that nearly 90% of the white people in the United States who have taken the implicit association tests have an inherent racial preference for white people over black people. Oh yes, race matters in America, and we've got to talk about it. It should not take a crisis for the United States to discuss race and the effects that stereotypes that are baked into our national culture. We should not have to wait for a police officer to shoot an unarmed black man before we discuss how negative stereotypes about black people affect snap judgments. It should not take mass murder in a Bible study to get us talking about how negative stereotypes of black people in social media help white supremacists rationalize their racism. Back in 1997, Professor Jody David Amor warned us that bad actors would try to make racism seem reasonable. Professor Amor wrote a book called Negrophobia. In it, he predicted that perhaps the gravest threat today to progress towards racial justice comes from the right-wing ideologues bent on convincing white people of good faith that negative stereotypes about blacks are justified. Professor Armour told us to look out for people trying to prove that blacks are inherently less intelligent and more violent than whites. And he explained that these people would try to make racism seem rational by using discredited studies, unscientific experiments, and Cook statistics. What have we seen on our social media over the past few years? We have seen that negrophobia is alive and well in the United States, and social media is its enabler. People like the president have used social media to spread Cook statistics and outright lies, to rationalize the racist stereotypes that black people are inherently violent.
Are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the president.
Countries like Russia have used social media to fuel racial tensions in America's communities. And white supremacists have used social media to organize their hate. We must not be afraid to ask, what role has Facebook played in fueling negrophobia in America? Facebook was born in an age of diversity, but it was not born with a commitment to diversity. Only 3 in every 100 Facebook employees are African American. The company has no black executives, and it has no black board members. The company's global director of diversity has said that hiring women and people of color is complicated. Its chief executive officer, Sheryl Sandberg, has promised that Facebook would hire a black board member sometime soon. Why has it taken so long? Why have minority voices been left out of social media development? Has Facebook's failure to value minority voices inside the company made Facebook an online megaphone for racist voices outside the company? Facebook's algorithms have the power to affect the way Americans think about black people, for better or worse. When Facebook accepts money from foreign actors who want to exploit racial tensions in the United States, Facebook perpetuates negrophobia. By the same token, Facebook's algorithms could weaken negrophobia by enhancing positive messages that challenge people to re-examine and resist discriminatory responses. But that will require Facebook to fully commit to diversity right now, not sometime in the future. And Mr. Speaker, we, the Congressional Black Caucus, met with Facebook a week ago in terms of these negative ads that were found out to be bought by Russian actors, and spending $100,000 in doing so, and buying fake Black Lives Matters responses and ads and anti-Black Lives Matter ads to continue to fuel this division in our country. And if countries are able to see a weakness in our fabric in this nation, then they will exploit it. We have to come together as Americans and understand that our issues are something that we have to deal with, and look each other in the face and have honest discussion about. No one is perfect. No one is saying that one side is worse than the other, but we need to come together as a unit, as this great experiment called the United States was meant to be, that all men are created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights. All Americans, not just some. And we continue to strive towards that goal, towards that utopia in this country. This is the greatest country in the world, and we all know it here because we benefit from it. But we have a long way to go in terms of reaching the ultimate goal. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back to the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the gentleman from Newark, New Jersey, for his comments, and also to talk about the fact that I'm glad that you mentioned Facebook, because one of the things that really surprised me was that the fact that some of those ads were purchased in rubles, and no one seemed to notice that. Seems absolutely amazing to me, and we need to, again, just continue to have a discussion and talk about these things. So thank you very much for your comments tonight. Now I would like to recognize my friend and colleague from the great state of Michigan, representing the state's 14th congressional district, Brenda Lawrence. And again, I want to thank Brenda for participating. She participates often in this hour, and just really appreciate your comments. Your district appreciates the comments, your state, and our country, and appreciate you joining us this evening.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank Congressman Vesey for his leadership, for his dedication. Today, I am at this mic for a number of reasons. One is that we have witnessed over the weekend another time in history that will be written for many to read, for generations to try to understand what exactly happened. Most of us are raised that in a time of grieving and mourning that you are sympathetic, you're patient, and most of all, you try to be understanding. I am for a loss and tried to understand how the dialogue was reduced to name calling and then just unfactual information. But what I had hoped, and what I feel that as an American, as a member of Congress, as a citizen, that if someone gets it wrong, that at least I deserve, I'm sorry. I didn't get the information right. Or maybe I spoke out of turn and you're grieving the loss of someone you love dearly, someone that was serving this country, someone who, as the family of a military service person, give the sacrifice as well for them to represent our country. I was hopeful that that would happen, but it did not. It comes a point in time, Mr. Speaker, that as American citizens, that we begin to stand up and say, as our country, there is an expectation. There's an expectation for those we elect, there's an expectation for those in leadership, and truly there's an expectation of civility, and at minimum, truth. As we know, the FBI has had a long, troubling history of using its broad investigatory powers to target black citizens. It's not a myth, it's a fact. It has been written. During the 1960s, Director Hoover used the counterintelligence program to surveil and discredit civil rights activists, members of the Black Panther Party. For an example, the FBI falsified a letter in an attempt to blackmail the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King into silence. So the Congressional Black Caucus is concerned by the assertion that coins the new term black identity extremists, and claims with high confidence that they are likely to target law enforcement based on perceptions of police brutality against African Americans. In August, the FBI Counterterrorism Division issued a chilling and outlandish warning to its agents, all hidden behind the veil of an internal report never meant to be seen by the American people. It worries me because in 2017, such a misguided and hateful and dangerous report exists at all. Released just 9 days before the hateful violence in Charlottesville, this report targets so-called Black identity extremists by falsely linking peaceful and necessary calls for justice from Americans, from the African American community, to entirely unrelated acts of violence against law enforcement. Mr. Speaker, I served as a mayor of a diverse city for 14 years and had the responsibility of an entire police force for a city. I have such respect and honor for those who serve us. I understand how when there's trouble, the police run to that trouble to protect us. But also know that the power that is held on the shield of a police force can be used for other than protection of their people. And that in this great country that we live in, time and time again in history, and some people will use the comment, don't be so sensitive about everything that happened. But history has shown us every change that we have made in this country, and freedoms and rights have come from people who had the courage, the political courage to stand up and fight for that. Is that extremism? Will you say the right to vote were Black extremists? Would you say that the women who protest and march so that women could have the right to vote, were they extremists? Or were there Americans who believed in this country and had the courage to stand up not just for them, but for generations to come? Our Social Security, when we looked at hunger in this country, and people who repeatedly have shown of all ethnic groups that nothing in America happens without protests and the courage to stand up. Are they extremists, or are they part of this amazing democracy that we have? And the threat of being labeled by our FBI, so you have permission to now treat these individuals who have the courage to stand up as unlawful villains and terrorists, and you have the permission now by the FBI to attack and to imprison them. We must, as a Congress and a country, learn to understand the power of our words. And I'm going to close with this. Your words mean something. If this administration has not taught us anything, the words of those who are elected to leadership does matter, whether it's the truth or whether it is a lie. It matters. It fuels anger and hatred in people. It tells people that it's okay to disrespect others. Words mean something. And for me to be a Black woman in America and be labeled, if I stand up and fight for my rights, if I stand with others, if Black Lives Matter has not just been Black people standing up, it's been all members of the United States, citizens saying that all lives matter and that we will not tolerate criminal injustice against Black people and the murder rate that we see of those who are of color. This has been a movement in our country, and now we see this internal labeling by our law enforcement in our country. Does that cause me to feel afraid in my own country? Does that give me the fear that history is going to repeat itself because words have given permission for this to happen? When you legitimize people who are standing, their only purpose to stand and be in a position in your community is to say that you have no value, you're less than me, and we hate you. But you know what? There's some very fine people there. Being a black person in America, I can tell you we've had some fine days. I would not be standing here, this little black girl from Detroit, if this country did not give me the opportunities. But it came on the protests, it came in the death and the riots of the people, my generation before me, who would not sit down and be quiet. So now are we being told that we are not to use our constitutional rights of free speech and protest and to gather to say that that is now you're being an extremist? I'm not going to allow that to happen in this country. And if you want to label me, label me. But I would not be here today if it's not for those who had the political courage to stand up for what's right, not just for black people, but for Americans in this country. And that is something that this report strikes a chord with me. I stand in opposition. I understand when someone takes their freedom to stand up and oppose something that's happening in America. And I want to protect that First Amendment right. But if we can avoid the consequences of hateful speech fueled by fear and false perceptions, we will be stronger as a country. Mr. Speaker, I call on Congress to join me and my colleagues in condemning this report and standing with us for a more peaceful and a more accepting and a more equal country, where we can really mean when we stand up and we say the Pledge of Allegiance and we say one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And for all of us, we have a name. We have a name that we were given at birth. And we expect our leadership, our president, our Congress, our chief of staff, our military to address us by our names. It is not acceptable. It is embarrassing for us as a country to reduce ourselves to that level. And I stand here tonight on the record that I'm an American. I'm a member of Congress. I'm a woman. I'm an African American. And I deserve respect, and I expect all of our colleagues to conduct themselves the same way, including the President of the United States. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your comments very much, very timely in light of everything that is happening right now. And Mr. Speaker, I would also like to enter into the record two of my colleagues that were not able to join us this evening. If we could enter their statements. My fellow Texan from the 30th Congressional District, Congresswoman Eddie Bernice Johnson, also has a concern about COINTELPRO and the COINTELPRO 2.0 to be precise, and she would like to have her statement submitted. And also Congresswoman Barbara Lee from California. Congresswoman Barbara Lee, as some of you may know, was subject to this COINTELPRO before she was a member of Congress. And so thank you to her for submitting this statement. Again, very important that both of these get on record in time because of everything that is going on right now.
Without objection, general leave is granted.
And Mr. Speaker, before I close out, the one thing that I would like to make note of is that I think that with this COINTELPRO 2.0 that's going on right now, that we take this very seriously. And I just want to remind everybody that may be out here listening right now, we talk a lot about extremist groups. We talk a lot about alt-right and KKK and white supremacist groups. But one thing that we have to keep in mind is that in the 1960s, when Dr. Martin Luther King came to town, he was not treated like he is now. I hear so many people, conservatives, liberals, Democrats, and Republicans, talk about how much they admire and respect Dr. King, and rightfully so, because he earned the respect of this, of the admiration that he has now posthumously in this country. I don't think that anyone would argue that. But if we could travel back in time to the 1960s, we would find that he was not that welcomed. And let's just put aside the white supremacists, let's put aside the alt-right, let's put aside these hateful forces that, again, all of us agree on, that these are bad people. But remember, when Dr. King came to some of these southern towns in the 1960s, he was not welcomed. And he was not welcomed by people at the Lions Club, people at the Elks Club, people at the First Baptist Church, people in the Methodist Church. Those people thought that Dr. King was bad, that he was stirring up trouble, that he was not, quote unquote, keeping his place, that he had come into these communities to stir up a lot of trouble. And because regular, everyday people, again, not the Klan, not the white supremacists, but just regular, everyday, tax-paying shopkeepers in these little southern towns, these conservative individuals that represented all segments of our society, thought that Dr. King was out of place for doing what he was doing. And because of that, the nation reacted. And one of those people that reacted against Dr. King, against Malcolm X, and against other organizations like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SNCC, which was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and many, many others, they ran domestic intelligence and the domestic intelligence counterintelligence program that you've heard about tonight, this COINTELPRO, and it became a weapon that was used to spy on individuals. And we heard you heard me mention earlier about our colleague Barbara Lee, that was one of these people that were monitored. But this was happening to everyday African Americans that were just out there trying to make sure that we could vote and that our water fountains and our schools weren't segregated. And these regular town folk, again, the ones that weren't in the Klan, that were just good old folks that went to Sunday school and went to church every Sunday, that they were trying to prevent this from happening. And J. Edgar Hoover stepped in and decided that he was going to discredit, disrupt, and neutralize these organizations, again, that was just trying to make sure that African Americans were no longer second-class citizens. And I think these groups and these organizations and these individuals that I mentioned earlier within the black community that were willing to be part of that struggle, I know that I would not be here serving had it not been for that surveillance that they endured. I know that I would not be here today were it not for them putting their lives on the line, quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, because of that. And so what I would just like to say is it's important that we monitor everything that is coming out of the Justice Department in relation to any announcements that they're going to make about investigating these organizations that they disagree with politically, because it is dangerous, and we don't want to go back to those times. We don't want to end up in a situation to where the organization is doing any sort of domestic spying on people that is practicing their First Amendment rights and free speech. And Mr. Speaker, I would like to inquire about how much time is remaining on the clock.
About 7 minutes.
About 7 minutes, okay. Well, Mr. Speaker, thank you very much for the time this evening. And and let me also just again talk about very briefly again just some of the things that that people are concerned about in regards to civil liberties. During the Cold War, that's when the FBI started running a lot of these counterintelligence programs. And Dr. King was always very high on the list. And that's what people are concerned about. Their concerns are concerns that are very warranted because of what happened. And I know that people always say, well, those things happened a long, long time ago. But in reality, there are people that serve with us in this body that sadly, they remember those days. So it didn't happen that long ago because they're still here, they're still active, very healthy members of society. They weren't members of Congress back then, but they are now, and they saw this up front. They saw this in a very personal way, and that's important. Also, one of the things that was mentioned earlier by Representative Payne from Newark, New Jersey, he talked about the fact about social media. Social media has been very convenient. It's helped spawn new wealth in this country. It has brought us together like never before, but it can also tear us apart if we let it. And we have to be very serious when we have a foreign entity, a foreign country that doesn't like America, that doesn't like our values, and they've been very open and blatant in saying that you can't have a multicultural society that exists. We need to take that threat very seriously. And Mr. Speaker, also, as I get ready to transition here, I mentioned earlier my colleague that was subject to some of the things I was talking about earlier, this COINTELPRO, and she is here with us and would like to yield time to her so she can tell her own story, because she can tell it more eloquently than I can, and that is Barbara Lee from California, representative that is very familiar with this, and we thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to thank the gentleman for yielding, but also Congressman Veazey for your remarkable leadership here in Congress and for hosting this very important special order this evening. Now, I rise along with my colleagues in the Congressional Black Caucus with a message for the American people. Wake up. COINTELPRO 2.0 is on the rise. Mr. Speaker, now in a report that was never supposed to see the light of day, the FBI's Counterterrorism Division branded African Americans in the fight for equality and justice as black identity extremists that pose a domestic threat to police officers. Now, I've witnessed many covert tactics designed to suppress African American activism in my life. But the revelation of this report is one of the most troubling details I have ever learned about our government. I remember very clearly the days of COINTELPRO under J. Edgar Hoover. As a community worker who worked closely with the Black Panther Party and their 10-point platform, which made programs like free breakfast for children possible and paved the way for our government's free breakfast program for low-income children, I witnessed firsthand how the lives of good people doing good work were destroyed by COINTELPRO. So seeing the emergence of what is effectively COINTELPRO 2.0, it's not only alarming, it is frightening. Just listen to how the FBI describes young men and women who take a stand for justice. According to the FBI, and I quote, black identity extremists, they call them BIE, their perceptions of police brutality against African Americans has been responsible for an increase in premeditated, retaliatory, lethal violence against law enforcement and will very likely serve as justification for such violence in the future. My God. Mr. Speaker, we know that all police officers aren't bad actors. Actually, thousands of officers, the majority of officers, go to work every morning to protect our communities and to provide public safety for everyone. But I want to be very clear about two things, Mr. Speaker. Police brutality is not, as they said in this FBI report, a perception. Police brutality is a reality African Americans grapple with every day. African Americans are 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white people. That's a reality. That's not a perception. The facts speak for themselves. Despite being only 13% of our population, nearly 25% of those killed by police in the United States each year are African Americans. That's a reality. That's not a perception. And nearly 99% of cases of police-involved shootings have not resulted in any officers involved involved were convicted of a crime. Now that is a reality, not a perception. And I also want to be very clear that black identity extremism does not exist. It's simply not real. No academics or journalists have uncovered such a movement. No one has identified as a leader of such a movement. And no act of hate or violence has been committed in the name of black identity extremism. So what is it then? It's a twisted attempt by arbiters of the alt-right, including Attorney General Jeff Sessions in this administration, to deflect attention from the realities of police misconduct and the alt-right and white supremacy. That's what it is.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House do now adjourn.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow for morning hour debate.